federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. is going to hear the fate of Donald Trump and see whether he and any president in the future will be immune from prosecution for criminal acts. That is what is at stake. And it's such a big deal and so important that Donald Trump himself is expected to attend this hearing tomorrow, where the court will decide, the DC Circuit will hear Trump's immunity claim and decide whether former presidents are immune. And this will not only apply to Donald Trump, but it'll apply to every other president that will ever be president and a former president in the United States. So everything is on the line. And it's a very, very big deal about whether a president can be held accountable criminally for actions while president. And that is what this is about. Donald Trump does not want ever to face the case in front of Judge Tanya Chutkan in Washington, D.C., because those 4 charges that Jack Smith has laid upon him are ones that the evidence will be horrendous. The evidence will be compelling. And Donald Trump doesn't want all of that to be out in the public open. A lot of it was during the Select Committee's January 6th hearing. So people obviously do know a lot of it, but there's so much more that Jack Smith has been able to develop through his case because he has subpoena power. And there's nothing like putting someone under oath pursuant to a subpoena to force them to tell the truth so that they don't perjure themselves and face prosecution in that way. Also with subpoena power, Jack Smith has been able to develop much more evidence than the Jan 6 Select Committee of the House was able to do. So it is a huge trial that Donald Trump never wants to face. But don't get anyone wrong. This will apply also to, because he was a former president, right? This will also apply to whether he could have stolen the documents from Mar-a-Lago. This could apply to whether or not if he were, or any future president were to become bribed or compromised in some way by a foreign official. This will apply to a president who uses their power for bad and not good. And the Constitution and separation of powers was all about making it so that presidents are not kings. That's a quote from Judge Chutkan, by the way. And it makes sense because that's what separation of powers is about. But so let's see what exactly is going to happen at this court proceeding tomorrow when the DC Circuit will hear the oral arguments. We think it's going to be audio taped, which will be great, so we can all listen to it and we can report on what this is. But what are the issues that are at stake here, and what will they be considering? Now, the DC Circuit is the interim appellate step in between the Supreme Court and Tanya Chutkan, who already ruled that Donald Trump is not immune, right, criminally for these actions that happened leading up to January 6th and January 6th. Now, no court has ever done this before. They've never considered whether a president is immune from prosecution. They've only considered whether a president is immune from civil actions. So, and presidents, like many others, including prosecutors and judges and other officials, are immune from civil liability if the conduct in question that they're being sued for happened while they were performing their job duties, or if it was beyond their job duties, but within the outer perimeter of what could be construed as their job duties. And so that's what the issue is. And if it falls into that outer perimeter, and that's why they use that term in all the court cases, then they would be immune from civil liability. But nobody has ever ruled on other than Judge Chutkan in this particular case, on whether presidents are immune criminally. And so that's what is at stake here, and that's what the DC Circuit will be considering. And so the two main issues that they will consider are essentially, is defendant immune from federal prosecution for the things done within the outer perimeter of his official acts, right? Judge Chutkan, P.S., did not even touch on the outer perimeter argument. Judge Chutkan just ruled that there is no immunity for crimes, period, right? It doesn't matter if you were doing it within your job or outside of your job. So you don't even have to get to the question of whether you were acting as president or as candidate Trump at the time that these actions were happening, because she believes, and I think that sounds right, that you can't commit a crime no matter what, whether it's in your job description or not. And how can committing a crime ever be in your job description? So I think that this outer perimeter test that, excuse me, that Trump is borrowing from the civil case, I don't think that the court will buy it, but who knows? And the second question that is being considered is, does his impeachment followed by acquittal in the Senate preclude his prosecution? And what exactly does that mean? So the Constitution allows for removal of a president, and others actually, not just a president, but we're talking about the president here. It allows through a removal from office, and that happens by impeachment. And the House has to vote articles of impeachment, which are essentially charges like an indictment. And then the Senate has a trial. And if the Senate convicts you, then you are removed. But that has nothing to do with a criminal prosecution. There's no criminal consequence. There's no conviction. There's no sanction other than removal. You don't get any sort of incarceration or anything else. What he believes, however, is that you have to be, what Trump is arguing is that you have to be impeached first and then convicted by the Senate and then prosecuted. And if and only if you're convicted by the Senate do you get to be then prosecuted. So I would argue, but he's also arguing double jeopardy. He's saying he was acquitted by the Senate and therefore double jeopardy. But by his logic, then double jeopardy could apply even if he was convicted. So what Trump is trying to say is that no matter what, a president or former president can ever be prosecuted for a crime. And therefore, whether you're convicted or acquitted by the Senate. And I just think it's apples and oranges. I don't think it applies, and it kind of makes no sense. But we'll see. I think it's pretty clear that the D.C. Circuit will rule this way because it's what the law and precedent and Federalist Papers and everything else. If you look at the history and the context of the the Constitution and the impeachment judgment clause, I just don't see it as having to apply in the way that Trump is suggesting. But again, we just don't know what will the Supreme Court do. I think it's pretty clear what the D.C. Circuit will do, since they recently ruled that presidents, if you're a former president, you are not immune for civil liability if you were not within the outer perimeter. And so there is no absolute immunity for civil liability. Why would there then be for criminal liability? So it's pretty clear the DC Circuit, I think, how they're going to rule. Ultimately, not on what grounds, but just what their ultimate ruling will be. But then it'll go to the Supreme Court. And Jack Smith is going to argue that kind of what I just talked about, that look, number one, defendant is not immune from federal prosecution. Separation of powers does not provide any support for immunizing a former president from federal criminal prosecutions. Separation of powers only applies to civil liability for official acts, citing Nixon versus Fitzgerald, and the constitutional text and historical practice and other immunity doctrines don't support defendants' contrary claim. This is actually reading from Jack Smith's filing, which is why I know this is what they're going to argue. Jack Smith also says, even if separation of powers limited federal prosecution of former president in some unusual circumstances, so even if it did limit them in certain circumstances, those principles do not require dismissal here. And even if a former president were entitled to immunity from criminal prosecution comparable to his immunity from civil liability, dismissal is not warranted here. That's where they're going to argue, because this was in the outside the outer perimeter. And Jack Smith is also going to argue that his acquittal at the impeachment trial does not bar prosecution. Don't forget, Trump also argued that the Senate lacked jurisdiction to impeach him, and now he's saying that they did and that it bars prosecution. So he just makes arguments wherever he goes and tries to twist it to fit the facts, even if it's contrary. If he argues one thing in one place and argues something different somewhere else, it doesn't matter. He just wants to say what he wants to say to get out and squirm out of the consequences in what he's doing without worrying about how it's going to impact him in other cases. So so it'll be the thing to watch or listen to. Trump is going to show up, which shows you how important this actually is and what the stakes are, because we know he only shows up to things he cares about. And what more is at stake than his liberty and criminal prosecution for the events of January 6th? So this is a critical thing that's happening tomorrow. One other just small point that is worth noting. As we know, Trump is all about delay, right? That's what he cares about, and everything about what his strategy is delay, because he doesn't want to face the music. And there's a little sentence at the end of the special counsel's brief. I think it's on the last page, that says that they respectfully request that the court issue the mandate 5 days after the entry of judgment. Now, that seems like a legal kind of throwaway phrase. Why is it in there? What does it mean? But appellate advocates and appellate experts, which I am not, by the way, but what they have opined that what this means is it's a very significant request that Smith is asking the DC Circuit to make sure that they follow, because if they don't enter it quickly, right, and do it in this 5-day period or 7-day period, if they don't issue a mandate after the entry of judgment and return the case to Tanya Chutkan, then this case will get delayed. But of course, we don't know what will happen with the Supreme Court. But because Trump's goal is delay, he wants to get elected, without having these charges happen, he's doing this by trying to freeze the process, right? Stop the trial process, which he has done successfully at this point. He has frozen Judge Chutkan's case so that it cannot proceed. But he does it. What does he do? He appeals at the very last minute. He waits several months. He will do everything he can to just stretch the time and stretch the clock to get closer and closer to the election so that this case does not happen, all trying to run out the clock. And it's unclear, and there's been lots of people who have argued and filed amicus briefs saying that they don't even think, number one, Trump was entitled to appeal midstream, that he should have had to wait till after conviction, number one, and number two, that I can't even remember what number two was, so I'll get back to it in a minute. Anyway, so he is this sort of mandate that Jack Smith is asking the DC Court of Appeals to issue quickly has to do with some Supreme Court rules, because an appellate court, when they decide a case and issue a decision, is not self-executing. And for the decision to go into effect, they have to issue a mandate. It's just a formality, if you will, but they have to do it. And there's a DC Circuit rule, I think it's 41A1, that the court mandate sets out the time period. And the bottom line is, between that and the Supreme Court rules. This could, if they don't do it quickly, Trump could delay this for up to 3 more months. And so obviously if that happens, again, it gets way closer to the election and might not ever even happen. So hopefully so just the fact that Jack Smith put that sentence in there shows he has his eye on the speedy trial clock. Don't forget, he tried to get the Supreme Court to hear the case, to leapfrog the DC Circuit and hear the case, so that he could skip over and go straight to trial, because he's doing everything he can to make this go quickly. And so far it is going quickly. The DC Circuit is hearing this on an expedited basis. And so hopefully we'll have a ruling maybe as early as the end of this week. It could be early next week, and we'll see what happens next. Trump will then appeal likely to the Supreme Court, and we'll see if they handle it quickly. There's no reason why they can't, except for the fact that there's so many other Trump cases before the Supreme Court. But there's no reason why they can't. And frankly, they're hearing the Colorado appeal, right, where Colorado booted Trump off the ballot. They're hearing that quickly because it's so important, because he could be prejudiced because the election's happening, and he shouldn't be the only one who benefits from a quick ruling, right, for a quick Supreme Court expedited ruling. So hopefully they will also do that same expediting things in this case too. But listen to the DC Circuit oral arguments. We will listen to it, and we will bring you our analysis of what the arguments are, and based on what the questions that the court's asking, where we think that they're headed. But this is really important, and truly everything's on the line and at stake. I'm Karen Friedman Agnifilo with Legal AF. Join me and my co-hosts every Wednesday and Friday.
Hey, Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.